For more than 2,000 years, the Phoenicians have occupied an outsized place in the history of the ancient Mediterranean, remembered as the great seafaring civilization that gave the ancient world its alphabet, that built trading networks stretching from the coast of Lebanon to the Atlantic shores of Spain, and that founded some of antiquity's most famous cities, including Carthage, the North African power that would eventually grow strong enough to challenge Rome itself for control of the Mediterranean world. Yet for all their fame, the Phoenicians have always been something of a historical paradox. A civilization whose cultural and commercial influence was unmistakably vast, but whose actual population history, whose real flesh and blood demographic story, was pieced together almost entirely from the outside, through the writings of the Greeks and Romans who came into contact with them, and through the archaeological remains of the cities, temples, and trading posts they left scattered across the Mediterranean coastline. Part of what makes this gap in the historical record so striking is that the Phoenicians themselves left behind remarkably little in the way of their own historical writing. Unlike the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, or the Greeks, no substantial Phoenician historical or literary archive has survived into the modern era. No royal annals, no epic poetry, no philosophical treatises comparable to what survives from their neighbors and trading partners. What has survived instead is largely material: inscriptions, funerary monuments, temple foundations, shipwrecks, and the archaeological footprint of the trading colonies themselves, along with the considerably less impartial accounts of Greek and Roman writers, who often had their own political and cultural reasons for portraying Phoenician and Carthaginian civilization in a particular light, especially in the aftermath of Rome's long and bitter wars against Carthage. The result is that much of what has passed for settled historical knowledge about who the Phoenicians actually were and how their civilization actually spread across the Mediterranean has rested on inference, analogy with better documented cultures like the Greeks, and the assumptions of later historians rather than on direct evidence from the Phoenicians' own biological and demographic record. That changed with the publication, in 2023, of the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted on Phoenician and Punic populations, led by geneticist Mark Haber and colleagues, examining genetic material recovered from more than 200 individuals excavated at 14 archaeological sites spanning the entire breadth of the ancient Phoenician and Punic Mediterranean world, from the Phoenician homeland on the Lebanese coast to colonial sites in Sardinia, Sicily, Ibiza, Malta, and North Africa. What the study found was not a confirmation of the traditional story most people, including most historians, had long assumed to be true. It was something considerably stranger and, in its own way, considerably more revealing about how ancient civilizations actually spread. The traditional story, the conventional historical narrative of Phoenician expansion, inherited largely from ancient Greek and Roman sources, and repeated in textbooks for generations, describes a process that closely mirrors the far better documented pattern of ancient Greek colonization occurring around the same period. In this traditional picture, the great Phoenician city-states of the Levantine coast, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos chief among them, reaching the height of their commercial and maritime power beginning around the 9th century BCE, are understood to have sent out waves of settlers, sailors, and colonists who established new Phoenician cities and trading posts at strategic points all around the Mediterranean basin. Carthage on the North African coast, founded according to ancient tradition by settlers from Tyre in the 9th century BCE, a network of settlements across Sardinia and western Sicily, Motia, Malta, and Ibiza, and Gadir, modern Cadiz, on the Atlantic coast of Spain, traditionally described as the westernmost Phoenician colony in the ancient world. Under this traditional model, these colonies were assumed to have been established and populated, at least initially, by actual emigrant populations, sailing outward from the Levantine homeland, merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and their families relocating from cities like Tyre and Sidon to found new communities abroad. In essentially the same way, ancient Greek city-states like Corinth and Miletus are documented to have sent out citizen settlers to found colonies of their own across the Mediterranean and Black Sea coastlines. Under this assumption, the population of Phoenician colonial sites like Carthage or the Sardinian trading towns would be expected, at least in their earliest generations, to show strong genetic continuity with the Levantine homeland population. The same kind of close ancestral relationship that the 2017 study of Bronze Age Canaanite genomes from Sidon had already documented within the Levantine homeland itself. What the 2023 study set out to do was test this assumption directly, using the same rigorous ancient genome sequencing methods that had already reshaped scientific understanding of the Canaanite homeland population, applied this time to the diaspora rather than the source. The methodological challenge facing the research team was considerable. Unlike the earlier Sidon project, which focused on a single well-excavated homeland site with an unusually favorable preservation environment, the 2023 study required assembling ancient Genetic material from 14 separate archaeological sites spread across several different countries and research traditions, each with its own excavation history, its own preservation conditions, and its own logistical and diplomatic considerations governing access to skeletal remains. The team sequenced and analyzed more than 200 ancient genomes in total, spanning a period of roughly 6 centuries, and compared the resulting genetic profiles against a wide reference panel of both ancient and modern populations from across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Near East, using the same kind of statistical ancestry modeling techniques that had proven so effective in the earlier Canaanite homeland research. This scale made it, at the time of publication, the largest ancient DNA study ever undertaken of any Iron Age Mediterranean civilization, and it gave the researchers enough statistical power to distinguish real population-level patterns from the kind of individual-level noise that had limited earlier, smaller-scale ancient DNA studies of the region. What the genomes actually showed. The results, published in the journal Nature, were strikingly different from what the traditional colonization model would have predicted. Across the 14 Phoenician and Punic archaeological sites sampled, spanning roughly the 8th century BCE through the 2nd century BCE, covering the height of Phoenician and Punic Mediterranean expansion through to the fall of Carthage itself, the research team found remarkably little direct genetic ancestry connecting the colonial populations back to the Levantine homeland. Individuals buried in unmistakably Phoenician and Punic cultural and religious contexts following Phoenician burial customs, associated with unmistakably Phoenician material culture, temples, and inscriptions, overwhelmingly did not carry substantial genetic ancestry from the Levantine coastal populations documented in the earlier Sidon homeland study. Instead, the ancestry detected across most of the sampled colonial sites traced back predominantly to 2 other regional sources: populations related to ancient Sicily and the wider Aegean world, and populations related to ancient North Africa. In practical terms, this means that the people who lived, worshipped, and were eventually buried as Phoenicians or Carthaginians at sites like Sardinia, Sicily, Ibiza, and even at Carthage itself were, in the majority of cases the study examined, not the direct biological descendants of colonists who had sailed from Tyre or Sidon at all. They were, genetically speaking, local Mediterranean populations, descendants of the pre-existing Sicilian, Sardinian, Aegean, and North African peoples who already inhabited those regions before. Phoenician trading networks arrived, who had adopted Phoenician language, religion, burial customs, and material culture as their own, without the accompanying mass replacement of the local population by actual settlers from the Levantine homeland that the traditional colonization narrative had assumed. The study also found that the genetic ancestry present across these different Phoenician and Punic colonial sites was remarkably diverse and highly variable, from site to site and even from individual to individual within the same site, in a way that stood in sharp contrast to the much more genetically homogeneous picture the 2017 study had found within the Levantine homeland population itself, where the Bronze Age Canaanite genomes from Sidon had shown a population with a comparatively stable, consistent ancestral profile persisting over centuries. The Phoenician Punic diaspora sites showed a genetic patchwork. Individuals with predominantly Sicilian-related ancestry buried alongside individuals with predominantly North African-related ancestry, in cemeteries that showed no consistent genetic signature at all beyond the shared cultural and religious identity written into their burial customs and grave goods. A cultural network, not a demographic wave. What this pattern suggests, according to the research team, is that the spread of Phoenician civilization across the Mediterranean during the Iron Age was fundamentally a different kind of historical process than the mass migration colonization model long assumed by analogy with the Greek world, rather than Levantine. Populations physically relocating in large numbers to found and populate new cities abroad, the evidence points toward a process in which Phoenician language, religion, technology, and trade networks spread outward from the Levantine homeland and were adopted, embraced, and locally reproduced by existing Mediterranean populations, who intermarried extensively with one another across the connected network of Phoenician trading ports, without a correspondingly large biological migration of people out of Lebanon itself. This is not to say that no Levantine people ever traveled to or settled in the Phoenician colonies. The study did identify individuals at some sites carrying at least partial ancestry connected to the Levantine homeland, and historical and archaeological evidence for direct trade contact, administrative connections, and at least some level of population movement between the homeland cities and their overseas trading partners remains solid and undisputed. But the overwhelming genetic pattern across the sampled sites indicates that whatever initial movement of Levantine people did occur in the earliest phases of colonization was, demographically speaking, quite small, and was rapidly diluted within a few generations by intermarriage with the much larger surrounding local Mediterranean populations, who made up the actual bulk of the colonial population from a very early stage onward. This finding reframes what being Phoenician or being Punic actually meant in a historical and anthropological sense for the vast majority of people who identified that way in antiquity. It suggests that Phoenician identity at Carthage and at these other colonial sites studied functioned much more like a shared language, religion, and economic and cultural network binding together a genetically diverse population of local Mediterranean peoples, rather than functioning as a marker of shared Levantine ethnic descent. In this sense, ancient Phoenician civilization looks, from the genetic evidence, considerably more like a cultural and commercial confederation that people across the Mediterranean opted into, generation after generation, than like an expanding ethnic homeland in the way the traditional colonization narrative, modeled so heavily on the Greek example, had long assumed. A useful contrast with Greek colonization. The comparison with ancient Greek colonization is worth taking seriously, rather than treating as a passing analogy, because it is precisely the model that generations of historians used, by default, to interpret the Phoenician case, given the comparative lack of direct textual evidence from the Phoenicians themselves. Ancient DNA research on Greek colonial sites in places like Sicily and southern Italy, the region the Romans themselves came to call Magna Graecia, has generally found a genetic picture closer to what the traditional model predicted for the Phoenicians. Meaningful, detectable ancestry connecting at least some colonial populations back to the Aegean homeland, consistent with the ancient historical tradition of organized citizen. Colonists sailing out from specific mother cities to found new settlements abroad, alongside the same kind of subsequent local intermarriage found almost everywhere in the ancient Mediterranean. The fact that the Phoenician case looks genetically different from the Greek case, despite the two colonization movements occurring in roughly the same region during overlapping centuries and being described in strikingly similar terms by ancient sources, is itself an important finding. It indicates that colonization was not a single, uniform demographic process replicated identically by every ancient Mediterranean civilization that practiced it, but rather a label applied by ancient and modern historians alike to what were, on the ground, meaningfully different kinds of expansion. In the Greek case, apparently involving a more substantial movement of homeland population, and in the Phoenician case, apparently involving a comparatively small founding population whose culture was subsequently adopted at scale by pre-existing local populations across the Mediterranean. The Carthage question. Carthage occupies a particularly interesting place within this new genetic picture, given its unique historical importance as the Phoenician colonial city that eventually grew powerful enough to build its own Mediterranean empire and fight Rome directly for regional dominance across 3 devastating wars. Ancient tradition holds that Carthage was founded by settlers from Tyre in the 9th century BCE, traditionally led by the legendary Queen Dato, and Carthaginian religious and cultural life throughout its history maintained close and well-documented ties to Phoenician religious practice, including the worship of gods such as Baal-Hamon and Tanit, whose origins trace directly back to the Levantine homeland. Yet the genetic samples recovered from Punic-era burial sites in the vicinity of Carthage and its wider North African and Mediterranean sphere of influence show the same pattern documented at the other colonial sites, a population that was genetically diverse, drawing substantially on North African and broader Mediterranean ancestry, with comparatively little direct genetic signal tracing back to the Levantine founding population the ancient historical tradition describes. This does not overturn the historical tradition of a Tyrian founding, a small founding population arriving by sea and establishing a new settlement with its ruling elite and religious institutions is fully compatible with a subsequent population that grew explosively over the following centuries through the incorporation, intermarriage, and assimilation of the much larger surrounding North African and Mediterranean population, in a process that could easily leave only a faint genetic trace of the original founding group within the much larger population that later Carthage actually consisted of. What the genetic evidence does complicate is any assumption that Carthaginian identity, at its height, corresponded to a population that was, biologically, predominantly Levantine in ancestry. By the era the Punic Wars were fought, the population of Carthage that Rome confronted as its greatest Mediterranean rival was, on the evidence currently available, a population whose ancestry was overwhelmingly rooted in North Africa and the wider central Mediterranean world, unified by a shared Phoenician-derived language, religion, and civic identity, rather than by shared descent from the Levantine coast. How this compares to the Levantine homeland. The contrast between the 2023 diaspora study and the earlier 2017 study of the Levantine Canaanite homeland population at Sidon is itself one of the more striking aspects of this broader body of research, because it shows two genuinely different historical processes operating side by side within the same broader Phoenician cultural world. Within the Levantine homeland itself, the coastal cities of Lebanon where Phoenician civilization actually originated, the genetic evidence points to strong, centuries-long population continuity, with the ancient Bronze Age Canaanite population persisting largely intact into the Iron Age Phoenician period and onward into the genomes of the modern Lebanese population today, as the earlier research demonstrated. But once Phoenician trade networks, religion, and culture began spreading outward across the Mediterranean, the population picture changes entirely. Rather than the homeland population physically expanding outward and replicating itself across new colonial territories, the way the traditional Greek-style colonization model would predict. What the evidence instead shows is a homeland population that stayed relatively stable and genetically continuous at home, while its cultural and commercial influence spread across the Mediterranean by embedding itself within and being carried forward by entirely different and already well-established local populations abroad. This is a genuinely important distinction for how historians and archaeologists think about ancient cultural spread more broadly. It suggests that the spread of a civilization's language, religion, and material culture across a wide geographic area does not necessarily require, or even typically involve, a correspondingly large-scale movement and replacement of population across that same area. A lesson that ancient DNA research has increasingly been demonstrating applies well beyond the Phoenician case alone, as similar studies of other ancient cultural expansions across Europe and the Mediterranean have, in some cases, found substantial population movement accompanying cultural change, and in other cases, including this one, found comparatively little. What critics and cautious voices have noted. As with the earlier Sidon study, researchers examining the 2023 Phoenician diaspora findings have been careful to note the limits of what the evidence can and cannot establish. The number of individuals sampled at any single colonial site remains relatively modest in absolute terms, even though the total sample size across all 14 sites combined represents one of the largest ancient DNA datasets ever assembled for this region and period, and some scholars have cautioned that burial populations recovered archaeologically may not perfectly represent the full social and demographic range of the ancient populations that once lived at these sites, since burial practices, cemetery location, and preservation conditions can all introduce sampling biases that are difficult to fully correct for. There is also an important distinction, raised by several scholars responding to the study, between genetic ancestry and lived ethnic or cultural identity. A population can be genetically diverse and drawn predominantly from local Mediterranean ancestry, while still meaningfully thinking of itself and being regarded by outsiders as authentically Phoenician or Punic, in the same way that ethnic and national identities throughout history have frequently been organized around shared language, religion, and civic participation, rather than strict biological descent. The genetic findings reshape our understanding of the demographic history behind Phoenician civilization. They do not, on their own, tell us how the people living in these communities understood or experienced their own identity, which remains a separate question best addressed through the surviving textual, religious, and archaeological record, rather than through genomic analysis alone. A civilization built on networks, not bloodlines. What emerges from this body of research is a picture of the Phoenician and Punic Mediterranean world that is, in its own way, more remarkable than the traditional colonization narrative it replaces. Rather than a single Levantine population steadily expanding outward and repopulating the Mediterranean basin in its own image, the genetic evidence describes a civilization that spread primarily as a network, a shared language, a shared alphabet, a shared set of gods and religious practices, and above all, a shared set of commercial and maritime institutions that took root among an extraordinarily diverse patchwork of Mediterranean peoples, from Sicily to Sardinia to North Africa to Spain, who adopted and carried that shared culture forward as their own generation after generation, while remaining, in the most literal biological sense, the descendants of the very different populations who had inhabited those shores long before any ship ever left Tyre or Sidon. It is, in the end, a story less about a people who conquered and repopulated the Mediterranean, and more about an idea, a language, a religion, a way of doing business and building cities and burying the dead, that proved powerful and portable enough to be embraced by dozens of genetically unrelated populations scattered across the SSS, here more than 2,000 miles wide, and to hold them together for the better part of a millennium under a single shared name that most of the people who actually carried it forward, as it turns out, were never biologically Phoenician at all. That is a genuinely different way of thinking about what an ancient civilization even was. It suggests that the map of the Phoenician Mediterranean, dotted with famous names, Carthage, Motia, Gadir, Nora, was never really a map of a single expanding people. It all but something closer to a map of an idea taking root, city by city, harbor by harbor, in the hands of populations who were never asked and never needed to share a common bloodline in order to share a common identity. 2,500 years later, it took a swab of ancient bone and a sequencing machine to finally show historians what the Phoenicians themselves perhaps understood all along, that what bound their world together was never blood, but everything blood is so often mistaken for,